Yeah, here we go. So welcome everybody for our weekly seminar series. Today we are hosting Dr. Michael McGlue from University of Kentucky in United States, who actually woke up very early to be here with us virtually, and we are very thankful for that. It's 6 a.m. in the morning in Kentucky. So Dr. Mike McGlue is an EES alumni, endowed professor at the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Kentucky, and director of the Kentucky Geological Survey. He holds a bachelor in geology from Washington and Lee University, and master in earth sciences from Syracuse University, and a PhD in geosciences from the University of Arizona. Prior to joining University of Kentucky, he worked as a Mendenhall postdoctoral fellow at the U.S. Geological Survey in Denver, Colorado. At Kentucky, his research group uses sediments and fossils to evaluate the impact of climate change and human activity on freshwater ecosystems, in aquatic ecosystems throughout the world, with special emphasis on the global south. They have conducting multidisciplinary analysis designed to answer questions related to hydroclimate change, the evolution of biodiversity, fisheries conservation, human landscape interaction, natural hazards, and reservoir resilience. So with these words, we're very honored to host you, Mike. And his talk today is Conservation Paleolimnology, Applications to Fisheries Sustainability in Lake Tanganyika in East Africa. So thank you very much, and the podium is yours.
Thank you so much. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay and can also see the pointer on the screen. I hope I've got this set up in a way that will be useful.
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And I usually start my talks about Lake Tanganyika, specifically when they focus on conservation, with a slide that looks like this, because it helps to illustrate the situation and the challenges that many of the lakeshore villagers, who are, of course, deeply impoverished, are facing nowadays. This is a very unusual situation for fishing villages along the lakeshore. Villages are not built this close to the water line. This is actually a function of a much more erratic water cycle that has seen rising lake levels across parts of Eastern Africa for the past decade or more. So they're feeling these challenges from a changing climate quite acutely these days. It also nicely illustrates some of the situation that's associated with land use change that has a kind of a feedback effect on damage to the fishery. You can see that on the hill slopes here, they've been converted for cassava. And so this is quite an interesting situation that has implications for the fishery and its function. So I'll talk about that as time goes by here. Okay, let's see, can I advance the slide? Yes, okay. So this talk will give you some information about Lake Tanganyika. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, you see it over here on the right-hand side of the screen. It's the large, skinny lake here in the Western Rift Valley of Eastern Africa. Talk about what makes the lake special, and I'll also talk about the problems that face its fish. There's three that we tend to focus on: destructive fishing practices, sediment pollution, and climate change. I'll focus on sediment pollution and climate change for this talk chiefly. And then I'll talk about how we use the science of paleolimnology for conservation purposes in this area, and then I'll conclude. So, by way of introduction, where is Lake Tanganyika? What is it? It is quite a remarkable ancient lake. It's the world's second largest lake by volume. You can see it here again in sort of the map view of Eastern Africa here. Here is Lake Tanganyika over on the left-hand side. It is quite a large lake, almost 33,000 square kilometers. Its watershed area is another multiple higher, about 230,000 square kilometers. It's exceptionally deep, which owes to its rift heritage. You can see the bathymetry over on the right-hand side of the screen. In its deepest areas, it exceeds 1,400 meters, so it's quite a deep lake in a number of parts. It is exoreic, meaning that it flows out, and you can see that in the digital elevation model here in the center of the screen. Here is the outlet approximately here where the pointer is. You can kind of follow that drainage out into the Greater Congo watershed, moving farther to the west. And it's meromictic, of course, meaning that it's permanently stratified and its bottom waters do not fully mix to the surface. When people are familiar with Lake Tanganyika, it's usually because of its biodiversity. It tends to be a textbook example of the development of biodiversity and endemism. This owes to the fact that it's quite an old lake. It has a very complex basin morphology because of its rift heritage. It's undergone quite a few cycles of lake level change that we're aware of, and probably many more that we're not. And of course, there's like lots of species interactions that happen in a lake of this size. And as a result, the lake has a number of unique species, flocks of cichlid fish, non-cichlid fish, gastropods, ostracods, and mollusks. So it's quite a speciose system that has garnered quite a bit of attention from the evolutionary biology community. In terms of climate, which is relevant for this talk, if we're thinking about climate change, one of the major facets of the climatology of Lake Tanganyika is the influence of the migration of the tropical rain belt. And that's what you're meant to be seeing here on the right-hand side. These are NDVI data sets that capture seasonality of change in the area. So Lake Tanganyika is here on both maps. And hopefully what you can see here is that the degree of greening of the landscape or the greening of the vegetation is actually tracking the position of the tropical rain belt. So in the austral summer, when the rain belt is farther to the south in the southern hemisphere, you can see that the area around Lake Tanganyika greens up as a result of rainfall. And when that same feature is farther in the northern hemisphere, we have drying. So we have a strong seasonal contrast in precipitation that affects the lake. We also have a very acute effect of the Southeast Indian Ocean monsoon, particularly when the rain belt is in the northern hemisphere. Essentially, what this situation allows is for winds coming off the Indian Ocean to blow up the long axis of Lake Tanganyika, which has a really profound effect on limnological function. And that manifests chiefly in upwelling. And of course, upwelling is really important for nutrient delivery to the surface water. So when the dry season winds arrive in the wintertime, we essentially have a situation where the surface water mass is pushed into the northern end of the basin. And that allows upwelling to happen, partial mixing and entrainment of nutrients from deep water, cold water, brought up to the surface, particularly in the southern basin, but there's a mixing factor that essentially helps to move some of those nutrients around and distribute them throughout the rest of the lake. So this is a really important process, the arrival of the strong monsoon winds in the dry season, really fundamentally important to nutrient delivery to the photic zone. This drives diatom production and cyanobacteria production. I will say there is a feature of this system that I won't talk too much about today, but it's something we're increasingly working on reconstructing with sedimentary records. And that's this secondary upwelling system that tends to affect the northern basin more acutely. This is essentially a phenomenon associated with oscillation of the thermocline following the dropping of the winds at the seasonal change. But most important for this talk is sort of the primary upwelling signal that happens in the dry season. And so this connects to fish quite directly. Okay, so we have physical climatological processes and limnological processes connecting to the pelagic food web. The food web is illustrated over on the right-hand side of the screen. It's quite a simple one in the pelagic ecosystem for a lake of this age and this complexity. It has 4 endemic species of perch. These are the lattes that you see here up at the top of the food web. There are 2 species of endemic clupeids, which are essentially a sardine-like fish at the next tier of the food web. The zooplankton are typically represented by copepods and shrimp, and sometimes jellyfish. And then, of course, down at the bottom of the food web, we have our primary producers. These are zooplankton. These are phytoplankton like diatoms. And so the idea here is that it's a bottom-up controlled food web, right? In other words, higher primary productivity down down at the base of the food web generally leads to a greater production of fish. And this is important because fish are really a crucial source of protein for more than 12 million people that live along the lake shores. It's actually their chief source of protein. There's not a big animal husbandry tradition in this part of the Rift Valley, and so fish are the thing as far as protein is concerned. So we can talk about the threats to the fish. This is a typical landing site in Lake Tanganyika. This is essentially a fishing village where people bring their catch onshore to distribute and sell. And the nets that you're seeing here show up in red with the fish showing up in silver. And hopefully you can get the impression here that these are not huge piles of fish, but rather thin. When I first started working in this part of the world, these mounds of fish would be close to my size, about 6 feet, a couple of meters high. Nowadays, that's clearly declining. You can also see some landscape changes that I think are interesting and relevant for the later part of the talk here. But so there's a lot to unpack in the pictures that you see. But let's talk about the threats to the fish. So there's really three facets to threats to the fishery that often get discussed when you're talking about any large inland lake in Eastern Africa, but Tanganyika in particular. So we have human impacts and climate change. Okay, and so destructive fishing practices, sediment pollution, and climate change tend to be the areas that people focus on most when thinking about damage to the fishery. And there's a lot of graphs in the literature that look something like what you're seeing in the lower left-hand side. This is essentially catch per time. And hopefully what you can see is an overall declining trend, particularly in the last several decades. These are two of the most economically important pelagic fish. This is one of the Lattice species and one of the Clupeids. And you can see this long-term decline towards present day. Okay, so the axis here goes from 1970 to 2010. And you see kind of a peak in the 80s and a long-term decline closer to present day. And most of the data that you'll see will look something like that from Lake Tanganyika's fishery. And so why is this happening? What's the cause here? Well, there are a number of facets that might explain this. Destructive fishing practices is certainly one potential. There are more fishers on the lake now than ever before, both commercial and artisanal fishers. In part, this is driven by very rapid growth of the population through high birth rates and refugee influxes. As a function of more people fishing, there tends to be an expansion of illegal gear and illegal fishing techniques. So there's over-harvesting of juveniles and removal of non-pelagic fish, the literal cichlids from the shallow water areas. Beach seining is common but illegal in Tanganyika. This is what you're seeing in the pictures here. And the upshot of that is shown over in the picture on the right-hand side. You see a few adults being harvested, but many, many fingerlings that present some challenges to the sustainability of those fish. Sediment pollution is also a really acute problem. This is really connected to slash and burn deforestation. As folks run out of food from the lake, they start to seek alternatives, and one of the major alternatives is agriculture. In order to have fields, you need to have space to put them, and so burning down forests and installing cassava or corn is quite common. It's sensible, but the damage that this promotes in as a function of erosion is actually quite crucial. What you're seeing in the pictures up at the top are two rocky lake floor substrates. The one on the right-hand side, you can see has lots and lots of fish over the top of it. This is what we think of as a pristine rocky lake floor. On the left-hand side, this is a scuba diver image of the same type of substrate that has been covered and blanketed by silt and clay that's eroded from the landscape. And hopefully you can see there's far fewer fish in this picture. So fish abundance, diversity, and body size really declines when we have this type of siltation and fouling associated with land use changes. So a really acute problem, and one that we've tried to study and get our arms around quite a bit more with geological data sets. And finally, climate warming. So we have low resolution paleoclimate data that suggests that fish may have declined as or started to decline as early as 150 years ago prior to the onset of commercial fishing. Now, this was a paper that we published a few years ago that involved Tex 86 reconstructions of lake surface temperature, two different proxies of pelagic function, essentially biogenic silica, giving us an idea about diatom productivity, and two measures of fish fossils, right, to try to understand changes in the fish stocks in association with some of these environmental changes. And hopefully what you can see here is that as temperatures are increasing, this is the x-axis here is time increasing towards the right. We have this increase in temperature that we start to detect around 1850 or 1860 or so, increasing towards modern. And at the same time, we saw a concomitant decline in biogenic silica and the number of fish fossils in our record, which gave us this potential idea that lake warming and its effects on limnological function may be contributing to collapse of the fishery and the pelagic food web. So this was an early low resolution look at how this may have worked that I think we've improved upon as time has gone by. And so there's a crisis looming here. Lots of people are in poverty in this area of the world. The dark color here in the central part of Africa indicates share of population in extreme poverty. So lots of people who have very little resources and very little resilience are really being affected by this change in their food source. Adding complication is the notion that most of the countries right around the lake are rapidly growing. So we have this decline in the availability of food resources, coupled with a growing population that's deeply impoverished. So obviously a really big challenge that doesn't get enough press nearly, in my opinion. And so what my research group has tried to do is to use some of the paleolimnological techniques that have become familiar to us to try to better understand environmental changes, improve lake management, conserve ecosystem services, and safeguard biodiversity. A really important aspect of this work has been on-the-ground collaboration with both government and NGO organizations to connect with the fishing villages themselves and get the information to them. So this is kind of a useful time to shout out the Tanzanian Fisheries Research Institute, Department of Fisheries in Zambia, really important partners for me working at Lake Tanganyika, and a number of different NGOs who help with small-scale co-management of fisheries there. And so there's three approaches we can take to think about this. I won't talk about how we deal with destructive fishing practices in detail here today, but for this group, it's certainly relevant. We use a lot of techniques for connected to marine geophysics for mapping benthic habitats in order to guide the placement of small-scale protected zones, or essentially small-scale no-catch areas. We know that large-scale no-catch areas like national parks tend to have much greater fish abundances and body sizes and so forth. So we use geophysics to map out lake floor substrates to more strategically place no-catch areas, and that's been a successful process for us. I won't dwell on it too much longer here. We've looked at sediment pollution and climate change using sediment cores. So sediment pollution, we can try to think about from the perspective of sediment accumulation rates, and we can get at a better spatial assessment and a temporal assessment on the nature of sediment accumulation and erosion. And we've also looked at the climate change question in much higher resolution than sort of our earlier study, chiefly focusing on indicators of upwelling at subannual resolution to better understand how that system works. And so the two main study areas are sort of in the central part of the lake here in Tanzania and in Zambia down close to the boot of Lake Tanganyika, if you will, here on the south side. So we'll zoom in on those areas here in a second. So the sediment pollution problem, this is what native vegetation looks like or should look like in Lake Tanganyika absent of any human landscape interactions. This is actually a national park close to one of the areas that I work. And so you can get a sense, hopefully, of sort of the lush vegetation and just how dense it is when it's not modified by people. when people modify it, you see the result. Okay, and so this is actually here in Tanzania. I'm looking to the south here. The Mahale Mountains are in the background, and we have what's typical in Lake Tanganyika is relatively steep lakeshore margins owing to that rift heritage. And hopefully, you can see off in the distance here that the topography just adjacent to the lakeshore has been modified, and a tilled field has been installed. Now, this is quite a common facet of the landscape of Lake Tanganyika today, as villagers have turned to agriculture to supplement their food, as the fish catch has declined. And it's quite a routine procedure for clearing fields like this. It's done with slash and burn. Okay, so they essentially burn the area where they want to install their plot in order to get rid of trees, get rid of root networks, and so forth. And they install their typically cassava field. Now, of course, the challenge with this, as I'm sure you can imagine, is when the monsoon rains arrive, there's really only one place for the tilled soil to go, and that's essentially down. And unfortunately, the delivery of that silt here to the littoral zone and the shoreline area has really a damaging effect on those heterogeneous rocky substrates that pelagic fish love to spawn in. And so we've tried to get a better handle on the spatial signal here and the extent of it using a field site in Tanzania that actually has adjacency to a national park. So we essentially have a natural experiment where we have a control where land use change has been minimal, and then a number of sites offshore fishing villages that have experienced considerable landscape modification and denudation of vegetation through fire. Okay, so we've collected cores offshore of all of these sites and studied their sedimentation rates. We do that with lead-210 geochronology, which I suspect many folks in the room here are familiar with. This is a short-lived fallout radioisotope with a half-life of about 22 years. It's produced in the atmosphere by the decay of radon-222. And so we look to develop lead-210 activity profiles with an idealized one shown over here on the right-hand side. We do this through alpha spectrometry, and we can model the data in a couple of different ways to get a better sense of just how fast sediment has accumulated in our study sites. And so the results are probably what you imagine that they would be. Okay, so stations that are offshore of areas that have had considerable landscape modification and vegetation change have sedimentation rates that average out to something like this from a linear basis, almost 0.2 centimeters per year and almost 0.1 from a mass basis. Um, Interestingly, these values are more than triple and more than double the mean rates measured at the control site within the national park. Okay, so the take-home message here then is that areas that are offshore from villages where there's been considerable removal of vegetation by slash and burn are accumulating sediment much more rapidly than a control site where the native vegetation is intact. And that should make sense that that would be what we predict, and indeed that's the case. There are a number of major controls on the accumulation patterns offshore that I won't unpack in a talk like this, but lake floor slope matters, distance to delta matters. Obviously, the nature of the onshore vegetation and the onshore slopes also matter for the rates of accumulation offshore. But take-home message here is that there's a really strong connection between the landscape and the lakescape. Okay, and so an interesting facet of our work thinking about how paleolimnology informs fisheries management is that actually conservation onshore is really important. Conservation of forests really critical for preserving those heterogeneous rocky lake floor substrates that fish love so well. Okay, so it's really important to fish. It's also important to the benthos of the lake, which is also quite biodiverse. The plot that you're seeing on the right here is simply a summarial diagram of mass accumulation rates in gray and linear accumulation rates in black. And you can see our control relative to our experimental stations, considerably higher accumulation rates offshore of those sites that have had considerable vegetation change. This actually is an important thought experiment, or can lead to an important thought experiment for a warmer future as well. Of course, we have a good sense of that vegetation patterns may shift as temperatures increase. And in East Africa, that typically means a transition from more trees to less trees and more grasses, which may in fact in the future portend greater erosion of the lakeshore moving forward. So we've gotten a sense from our data that spatial sedimentation rates are varying quite a bit. They're certainly impacted by deforestation. Let's think about the climate change question, right? And so our prior studies have suggested that lake warming was important, but the truth is that for conservation purposes, if we're really only detecting change at the centennial scale or the millennial scale, which is kind of where it was about a decade and a half or so ago, it's really difficult for folks on shore, managers, sustainability planners, and so forth, to enact any reasonable and effective conservation measures. Really, what you need is insights that are actionable on the human timescale. So annual, seasonal, decadal can certainly be useful for conservation. And so we sought to try to understand changes to the pelagic food web from that temporal framework. And to do that, we actually came to the southern part of the lake. Down here, you can see the inset map shows where we're coring in southern Lake Tanganyika. There's a little bit of a seismic database that exists for Lake Tanganyika. So we chose what we'd hoped would be a relatively rapid accumulation site here in deep water in the southern part of Tanganyika to get a better handle on climate change effects on the upwelling system. And so this is a bunch of data associated with one of the cores that we have from this part of the lake. This is a simple radiocarbon age model for the core. There is a tephra in the core that we actually know the age of that particular feature. So we have a handle on the timeline of accumulation for this particular core. You can see the core photo on the right-hand side. It's a really beautifully laminated core with a tephra and some facies variability as you move up section. The wiggle plot on the right-hand side is magnetic susceptibility. So you can get a sense of where we have variability in the core from the perspective of terrigenous inputs. And we have this kind of beautifully laminated section, which is actually not unusual for offshore deep water cores in Tanganyika. So using this particular record, we developed some proxies for upwelling, which of course connects to fisheries through that food web and its effect on primary productivity. We were also interested in lake floor ventilation with oxygen, which tends to be detectable with some of our geochemical tools to try to get a better sense of this particular system. So this is what we looked at. We did some scanning XRF at very, very fine scale resolution and developed a typical silicon to titanium ratio to get a proxy for diatom production. And this correlates really nicely with diatom concentrations. So we feel pretty good about the effectiveness of that particular ratio for proxying diatom production. We used iron to manganese to give us a sense of lake floor redox conditions, and that'll show up in orange in the next set of panels. Again, thinking about the upwelling system, upwelling should change lake floor oxygen to a certain extent, or at least ventilate some areas of the lake floor as that material or as those molecules are brought up to the surface. We have a diatom proxy that we've developed, centric to Nitsia ratio. This gives us a proxy for production and preservation of diatoms. This is what Nitsia look like in Lake Tanganyika. If you're curious, it tends to be the bane of the existence of diatom paleoecologists for working in the system because Nitsia are super abundant and very diverse. And so counting them is quite a challenge. We also measured bulk or sedimentary nitrogen isotopes to get a proxy for cyanobacteria through nitrogen fixation or through their capacity for nitrogen fixation. And we also did phosphorus measurements to better understand nutrient burial dynamics. And so this is what this particular record looks like. Those same colors preserve throughout the plot. So you're looking at silicon to titanium in blue, iron to manganese in orange, our centric to Nitsia ratio in red, Del 15N in yellow and phosphorus in pink. And so this record is about 1,000 years long as a part of the Common Era from about 580 to 610. The gray shading on the plot here are areas that we infer to be vigorous upwelling. Okay, and so hopefully you can get a sense of the periodicity or sort of the episodic nature of strong upwelling in this system. If we look at just the silica to titanium, you can kind of see that this is not a persistent feature of that sedimentary record. It's actually quite episodic and discrete. And interestingly, it aligns with some of these other variables that we might anticipate um, occurring in association with high upwelling. Okay, so high diatom productivity should follow with some minor ventilation of oxygen. I should mention that this coal was collected in about 400 meters of water, or relatively close to that, as best as we can tell. So there should be a bit of ventilation of oxygen, although not full oxygenation. Abundant nitsia due to the preservation factor, so that ratio should go low. Detectable N2 fixing cyanobacteria, so values of the nitrogen isotope data decrease moving up here. So these guys tend to flourish at the end of the upwelling season, at the transition in the winds. And of course, abundant phosphorus burial. Okay, and that's a more noisy plot, but hopefully you can see that the gray shaded areas tend to have higher phosphorus associated with them. So what this record tells us then is that we have multi-decadal to centennial periods of strong upwelling juxtaposed with intervals where upwelling clearly falters, and you see those in white here. And so as we compared this record to global records of climate, a couple of factors emerge. One is if you look at the silica to titanium ratio, you can kind of get a sense that there is some relationship between upwelling in Lake Tanganyika and diatom production and solar irradiance maxima. Okay, so there is some shape similarity to those two records. And that makes sense. It would make sense that that would be the case because solar irradiance maxima should strengthen monsoon winds and ultimately drive the dynamic of primary production in the lake. Lake warming, which is shown here, this is another Tex 86 reconstruction, certainly does seem to influence the lake system as well, potentially as a feedback on stratification. Okay, so as temperatures rose in this part of the record, and you can kind of see that overall progression here if you follow the mouse, you see in areas where we might anticipate upwelling simply based on solar irradiance to actually be areas of faltering of upwelling. Okay, and so that's kind of an interesting observation as well. The other facet that we think is at play here is ENSO. Okay, so hopefully you can see the ENSO reconstruction. This is a Southern Oscillation Index reconstruction from the Pacific Ocean. You can see in times of strong La Nina, which connects with stronger trade winds affecting Eastern Africa, we tend to have intervals where we have stronger upwelling. In contrast, when El Nino is more dominant, these tend to be intervals when upwelling falters at Tanganyika. So if we put all of this together, we can think about the fish catch being at risk at Tanganyika from a number of different perspectives. Clearly, climate change from its influence on wind strength and lake temperature have the capacity to influence upwelling at very high frequency in the lake. And that's actually happens at timescales that we can prepare for as lake managers and conservationists. Local human activities, particularly through land use changes, but also through destructive fishing practices, heighten the threat to the fishery. Importantly, through deforestation. Okay, so that coupling between deforestation, erosion, and sediment accumulation can really amplify the damage to the fishery through sedimentation rates. So I think what we've learned in part is that conservation paleolimnology offers some additional context for decision makers. We can tell folks, where effective spawning habitat is, what the nature of sediment pollution is in areas, and the timescales over which we might anticipate lower fish catch associated with the faltering upwelling system. None of that really matters if it doesn't make it to the right people. And so it relies on multidisciplinary team building and local engagement for things like assessment, enforcement, and financial supplementation. My group has worked really hard to scale this up to a full lake scale. We've started kind of in small areas. It's a really big lake with a lot of complicated dynamics, both politically and environmentally. We're working on scaling that up lake-wide. And so I will stop there. A little more than half an hour, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I open here for the audience to ask questions. Jare,
Does the tectonic activity going on at the lake, does it affect the, I don't know, the fishes or anything there?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
The tectonic activity going on, did you put it into consideration when you were working on the research? Like maybe if it influences like the sediment or like the habitat of the fishes or something?
The tectonic activity.
Yes.
Yes, so the tectonic activity, for the most part, the time scales over which those processes really shift the lake system are longer than what we generally consider in a conservation context, except in one particular instance. So the lake is active from the perspective of earthquakes, especially in the south. And so one potential influence of tectonic activity on how the fishery functions is mass wasting delivery of sediment to the lakeshore, particularly large particle sizes, boulder sizes and above, that can actually impact the nature of littoral zone substrates. In our research, we don't have great evidence for considerable influence, particularly in our sedimentation rate study of near-term earthquakes. Probably as you move farther south in the lake, there is increasing potential for historical earthquakes to actually influence the nature of sedimentation more recently.
thank you very much.
Thinking, based on the structure that you showed us, the symmetry of the lake, it kind of reminds me of the Gulf of Eilat. With, it gets deep very quickly and pretty narrow. Are there any, I know Eilat's a sea, but are there similarities or places where the research touches on each other between the lake and the sea?
That's a great question. I'm not entirely sure. I think the most rifts that are occupied by water bodies tend to have a structure that's similar to what you're seeing here. Okay, and so probably if I had made a better map, this would show up more clearly. But you can kind of see it in the topography here. Essentially, where you see darker green on the map here is areas where you have rift escarpment faults. Okay, so these are essentially the footwalls of normal faults. And it's always the case that where we have that type of margin coincident topography, right offshore, we have this very steep drop off into very, very deep water. Okay, so this is the deeply subsided half graben. So this would be the hanging wall component of the system. And so in areas where you actually see the darkest shades of blue in the bathymetry, those very much connect to the structural configuration of the basin. And so that's the type of pattern that you see elsewhere as well in rifts that are occupied by large water masses. Connectedly or relatedly, in areas of the lake where we actually have the interacting tips of faults, and one such is right here in the center of the lake. You can actually see one of the border faults here and an opposing one on the opposite side. These tend to generate sublacustrine horst blocks, right? So where we have tips interacting, we get what are called accommodation zones that tend to be thinly sedimented, where sedimentation rates tend to be very, very slow in those environments. So some of the oldest records from the lake we've actually pulled from those sorts of environments. So the tectonic configuration is really important consideration for where we core, and based on our objectives, we select for that specifically. And certainly lots of relationships and similarities to other continental rifts elsewhere.
Thank you. More questions?
Maybe a stupid question. I want to know if upwelling, if absence of upwelling is such a big problem because we don't have enough nutrients to feed the plankton and fish. Why doesn't it, at least at some part, compensate by bigger sedimentation? Because if we put some soil, there is some iron in it and stuff. Why
And
not
that,
even out?
Sure. No, that's a great question. So I think of that question from the perspective of what matters more. Is the nutrient delivery from the landscape more important, or is internal cycling of nutrients more important? Right? Because that's essentially at the heart of your question. Um, there is an important role to play for runoff for helping to recharge nutrients in the lake. But because of the lake's depth and its size, the internal recycling of those nutrients is overwhelmingly more important to primary production, right? So, let's say, for example, in your scenario, we shut off the dry season winds and stopped upwelling and increase the rainy season. Wouldn't that compensate for it in some way in terms of nutrient delivery? It would not. There would certainly be primary production in the system associated with runoff and nutrients from the runoff, but it would not be at the scale and the volume that the lake experiences when you have vertical nutrient recharge from depth. And so that's a great question. But yes, the upwelling system and the internal nutrient cycling is orders of magnitude more effective for driving primary production in the photic zone than is simple runoff. And there's actually box models that speak to that. So it's quite an excellent question, but it's something that I think we have a pretty good understanding of.
And another question, just curiosity on how it all works socially. Are there local initiatives that are not on the very high level and are coming from the people who live around here? And when you did this small conservation zone, what social effect it did on the community?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So it's crucial in any scientific endeavor like this to have buy-in from the local community and to engage with them quite actively, because in actually implementation of any of the conservation measures requires their partnership, requires them to buy in and actually work on those problems. And so there are complex social dynamics that are at play here, particularly when advising people to not fish, right? To avoid fishing in certain seasons or in certain areas. That's really challenging because people need to feed their families, right? So that's a very basic social dynamic is, okay, the fishery is in decline, and yet we still have this need for food. And it could be argued that the need for food is even greater because of the growing population. And so what has been done to help that situation from the social aspect is severalfold. One is microfinance instruments. So there's actually opportunities to pay lakeshore villagers small amounts of money so that they could buy rice and buy other food and have that supplement their diets in times when we're trying to protect the fish in the lake. So microfinancial instruments is one big one. Climate smart farming practices have been another, helping people understand how to farm better and more effectively. To help with that issue. Family planning is actually another fairly big one. Okay, there's a huge issue that confronts a lot of these sorts of systems in sub-Saharan Eastern Africa, and that is that the birth rates are remarkably high. And so if every family has 7 or 8 children and all of those children are quite young, right, there's a clear human health priority for getting food to those children. So, the social dynamic of family planning has been another aspect that has fed into this research. And that has come through engagement with the villagers themselves and understanding their situation, right? Because simply from, a science perspective, those sorts of dynamics don't tend to emerge, right? We simply, want to identify the problem and then try to fix it from the environmental perspective. But that is in a sense decoupled from the social dynamic that exists on shore for the people who actually need the food. Another really unusual aspect, and I'll return to the first picture of the talk for this, that we weren't aware of when we started, is that part of the modification of slopes in and around the landscape, which is, I think it's sort of a closed case that's not an effective way of farming, because of the potential for erosion and runoff into the lake. Part of that dynamic exists because of private property and inheritance customs. And so we came to understand that one of the reasons why folks were actually doing that was, yes, it was driven by the need for food, but it was also driven by, I've inherited some land and I need to claim it. And one way to claim the land is to actually put a field on top of it. And so there's complexity to those social dynamics that feed back on, the conservation mission. And so that's something that we've had to learn as scientists. And of course, partnering with NGOs is hugely important for that because, as geologists, we can't do everything, right? We kind of have a limited, purview and remit for studying in the area. But knowing those social dynamics is actually crucially important because it does inform how conservation gets enacted. It's an excellent question.
How many years do you predict it will take to have some effect? Coming to people and saying, don't fish, don't farm, and how quick it's going to have its effect?
Yeah, that's also a great question. Within 2 seasons, we've seen through our diver surveys a restoration of fish numbers and fish body sizes. And so it's a relatively rapid process. But 2 seasons can be life or death for the people living on the lakeshore. And that's why these other, instruments to supplement their diet and to supplement their protein have been hugely important. We could never say don't farm, right? That's a very clear way that, in the absence of fish protein, people can find food. But we can optimize the farming practices, put in siltation fences, abate some of the erosion. So there's ways, I think, of adapting that to allow the people to continue carrying out their lives without without too many pain points.
Cool. More questions?
As far as seismic activity goes, do we see any deposition in the sediments that are indicative of lake mixing or deformations like seismites? Just it's what I'm studying in the Dead Sea, so if it's similar as far as the geology, it'd be interesting to hear.
Yes, so there certainly should be, and it's a great question. So the seismic database, so in terms of active source seismology, there have been, a number of experiments on the lake. Most of them occurred in the 1980s, and so most of the data that exists for Tanganyika, uh, are these large-scale multi-channel seismic lines that, the vertical resolution here is at the scale of several meters. Okay, so it gives you the opportunity to look at rift structure and kind of overall stratigraphy. The details of the stratigraphy are still not well understood. I would be shocked if there weren't, good evidence of seismites in the lake, particularly in the south. It's just that those data have not yet been collected. We know it's seismically active, right? We can pinpoint the location of earthquakes, and there are certainly earthquake clusters, at both ends of the lake, both north and south, but most numerous in the south. And so I would be very, very surprised based on the lake's marginal configurations and, sediment storage in the shallow water areas if there weren't good evidence of downslope movements in association with earthquakes. It's just we don't have, the seismic database yet to actually address this. It's one of the areas that my group has started to work in, albeit elsewhere. But we now have a chirp system on the lake, so we'll actually have the capacity to do some better imaging. So in a couple of years, we may have some answers for you. But I would be surprised if they weren't there.
Thank you very much. Is the systematics of the geophysics that you're going to use for high resolution a pinger?
Yeah, so we have it's an older EdgeTech X-star system, so it's the 0.5 to 12 kilohertz system. So that's the primary tool we intend to use.
Cool.
But I should say, the crazy part about and you'll be aware of this, Nicholas, but maybe for the group it's beneficial. While we have some understanding of the basic depth structure of the lake, actually even the details of the bathymetry are poorly known. The lake is not well explored. Okay, so seismically we have some, you know, crude, albeit nice, multi-channel images that give us something about gross structure and stratigraphy. The details of the stratigraphy and the sedimentology are not well understood. Surficial features on the lake floor, such as one might have with multi-beam or side scan sonar, are really, really limited. So there's a great deal of very basic marine geophysics and geology that are unknown at Lake Tanganyika, and they're unknown for most of the large rift lakes in Eastern Africa. And so this is, it presents an opportunity, but it's also a bit of a daunting challenge given the scale of these systems. It would be wonderful to put sail drones out on a system like Tanganyika to collect a lot of these data. Unfortunately, the social dynamic there, I think, would make that very, very challenging. It's something I would love to do, but there would need to be buy-in from all the fishermen that the drones would be left alone, which would be a big challenge.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, another last question because I think we are, yeah.
The seismic activities on the rift are very active to date. So I'm thinking if they are active with this, it will tend to maybe sink. Will this even out the increase in the input, the water input with time? Is it a factor that is put into consideration?
So the long-term subsidence rates relative to the sediment inputs?
Leading to the gradual sinking of the lake basin.
Yeah, I think, so there's still a lake there, of course, and it's quite deep. So clearly the subsidence has outpaced the capacity for the surrounding watershed to infill the system. Now, at the time scale or time frame over which that would eventually catch up, we're talking about millions of years, absent of some, very unusual circumstances in the watershed. So yes, I think, there's obviously progressively the valley will fill in over time, but certainly over much longer time scales. Right? There are a couple of big drainages that enter into the lake, many small ones. As with the seismic activity, could we have large scale changes to that dynamic? I tend to think it would happen over very, very long time scales. And there's a lot of space left yet in the valley to be filled in. So we're talking about millions of years of process in order to get to that place where you transition.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mike. Really appreciate very much, and especially for waking up so early in the morning.
Sure. Happy to do it. And thank you for the questions and your time.
Okay. Have a great day, okay?
You too. Take care, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.